And here to talk about rural flight is Dan Chadwick with the Idaho Association of Counties and Wayne Hoffman with the Idaho Freedom Foundation. We tried to get another lobbyist to join you guys, but they were all afraid of you too. So it had nothing to do with them being too busy or anything. So when we're talking rural flight, is this an issue, first of all, that the state is facing, and what, if any, role does the government play in addressing it?
Rural flight is an issue in the state of Idaho. When you look at some of the communities around the state, I think we've talked about a couple of them in the past. Looking at Clark County, we're looking at Camas County, we're looking at Shoshone County, and what's going on in those communities where there are no jobs available for the youngsters to come back to. There's no real economy at all. When we see the loss of our natural resource economies, there isn't anything for them to do, so they have to go elsewhere to find and make a living.
So how do you look at the problem? Is this a problem at all, or is it just the natural way of things and progression? And then does government have a role in addressing some of the population shrinking?
It's a problem. I don't want to harken back to Reagan, but I will. Government's not the solution to the problem. It is the problem. What Dan said about the availability of our natural resources, we're stuck in a lot of these communities because the federal government has locked up the development of natural resources. In addition to that, we have confiscatory tax policies and regulatory policies that make it very difficult for people to simply earn a living in our rural communities. If you get the government out of the way, I think you will open up all forms of economic opportunity in our rural communities.
With that in mind, a lot of the people we spoke to in some of the communities we visited said that two of the biggest things that they face is broadband and infrastructure. Is that a place where government has a proper role in looking after these communities?
Well, sure. Our broadband efforts in Idaho are doing spectacularly. Note the Idaho Education Network. I mean, my point is that I don't think you want to get government more involved in putting those infrastructures in place. What you want to do is you want to remove the regulatory and tax barriers that make it more difficult for businesses to invest in the state. Right now, for example, we have a 7.4% personal and corporate income tax rate. That is a disincentive for businesses to want to come here, whether to rural Idaho or even to urban Idaho. But particularly the rural parts of our state hurt the most. We also have a tax policy that tends to benefit larger businesses, which will want to migrate towards our larger urban population centers rather than locate in a Chalice or an Idaho City or Du Bois or whatever it may be. There's a lot of towns out there that need economic opportunity, and our state policies are killing. They're not helping our communities out there.
I'm less tentative than Wayne on the need for government assistance in these communities. No one else is going to build the roads. No one else is going to build the schools. No one else is going to build the basic infrastructure, the public safety infrastructure that you need in these communities in order for someone to want to come back there. So there's a definite role for government. The question is what is needed and what the burden will be for the taxpayer in order to bring the economic development back.
And speaking of the tax base, with the shrinking communities, you also have a lot of times with the census data an older population, which means not as much of a tax base to rely on for some of these services. And so do we in Boise, not just as citizens, but the policymakers have a responsibility to take care of the people who are still in those communities? I know that's another philosophical question, but how do you look at that?
Does the government have a responsibility to take care of the people in those communities? No. I mean, the people in Idaho are independent people. They didn't move to Idaho so government would take care of them. At least I hope that's not what we're looking at here. What I think Idahoans want is to largely be left alone to carve their own path forward. The problem that we have, I'll just give you a quick example of where the government has made it harder. Just yesterday, the House Transportation Committee approved a rule that said if you want to have an auto dealership in the state, you have to post your hours and operate a minimum number of hours per week. Well, if I'm a farmer in Chalice and I'm just trying to make a little extra money and so I open up an auto dealership, that regulation has made it very, very difficult for me to earn a living, or wherever that may be. So I'm saying let's get the government out of the way so people can do what they do best, which is be self-sufficient and self-sustaining and put more economic development into their own communities without the government interfering with that.
When you have retirees in, say, Avery, which is a long drive from the nearest hospital, is there a place for government, looking at public safety as far as making sure that if they need an ambulance, it's going to be there?
There's a definite need for public services in those areas when you have an aging population. We do things for the aging population, by the way, in terms of their tax burden. We have the circuit breaker program, where the state steps in and pays a portion of the property taxes for individuals that would qualify, that are of limited means and need that assistance in order to keep their homes. We need the ambulance districts, we need the law enforcement, we still need all of those basic services. We need water and sewer, we need solid waste. If people are going to live in communities, those are necessities, those have to be taken care of. The question is, what is the burden for the folks that live in those communities, and how do you address those problems? It's not easy, especially when they're on limited incomes.
I'd argue the value of the circuit breaker, because the same people go to the grocery store, which is being taxed into oblivion because of all the different games that are being played with the property tax. But that's another story for another day, I guess. But again, I don't want to keep going back to tax policy, but I will. Here in the 21st century, a person can live anywhere in the country. I can work for a company in New York or Florida or Alabama, wherever, and I could choose to locate in Chalice or Malad or any place. But the problem is that there's really not an incentive for that. You can live in a rural community in Idaho, have a great deal of income coming in, go to the best schools, have access to the best teachers because of our access to technology. But the Idaho government, and frankly the federal government by extension with the lands policy, are making it harder for those communities. That's where our problem is.
Speaking of some of these smaller communities and the smaller counties, I know that this is an issue that you're always keeping an eye on, revenue sharing and also what the state legislature does, the policies that they make that do affect local municipalities. And so let's talk a little bit about that structure. I know that that's something that you are concerned about and a structure that you say works. Can you walk us through that a little bit, Dan?
Counties and cities receive about 11.5% of the revenue sharing that's produced by the sales taxes in this state. That money goes towards basic services in every community that receives that money. Without that, property taxes are not sufficient to cover all of those basic services. So we rely on the state's generosity in providing those dollars for local government in order to do our basic job.
And I know that that's something that you're not so happy with.
Well, I think we need to have a larger conversation about what our tax policy looks like and how it impacts communities throughout Idaho. For example, go up to a place like New Plymouth and look at the types of economic activities that are taking place in that town. Then look across the river towards Ontario, and you'll notice that all the economic activity is taking place not in Idaho, but in Oregon. And that's why we keep coming back to let's do something about the grocery tax. So we have sort of things that are on autopilot, such as revenue sharing, and people not asking questions about what are the pros and cons of that policy. We even have various exemptions that have been built into the state's general fund revenue stream. For example, the ag property tax exemption that I think was passed in 2000, where the counties were compensated for the loss of personal property tax revenue. But we don't have conversations about what that means and what the consequences are 15 years out. And I think those are the things we need to be talking about, which get us to a lower, flatter, fairer, and more predictable tax system, which will benefit all of Idaho. But we're not having that conversation right now.
That tax exemption for ag equipment, by the way, is a flat $12 million. It started at $12 million when it was created. It's $12 million today. That's pretty predictable. So we know what we're going to get from that exemption. What we don't know what we're going to get is unpredictability is what happens if the personal property tax goes away, for example.
But see, it's predictable to the counties. It's not predictable to the taxpayer. That's the problem. Right now, I can live in a house and it's $150,000. Next year, my taxes could go up 20%. There's no guaranteeing anything about that. So for a person who's just scraping by, or maybe even a first-time home buyer, who does the calculation about what their mortgage payment's going to be, including the property tax, that is devastating when you get your property tax bill and you found out that it's gone up 20 or 30%, and it does happen in places.
When we're talking about what he's talking about, flat tax proposals, making things more predictable to the taxpayer, what are the implications for counties?
Well, again, we rely on the property tax as our basic operational revenue with assistance from the state through the revenue sharing. Plus we get federal dollars through PILT, for example, because we have quite a bit of public land in this state. And then we have what's called secure rural schools, which is not funded right now, which will result in a loss of about $26 million in revenue to highway districts, counties, and schools if it's not reinstituted by Congress. That points out the problem of the lack of a good, strong natural resource economy in this state. We wouldn't need that $26 million if we were back to timber harvest and supporting our natural resource economy. That's what the counties would really like to have. That makes strong communities, good paying jobs, mills operational, a great market for timber products. We'd love to see that happen again. That will help communities survive. And we're not seeing that right now. So there's no predictability there for us. Again, the problem is if we don't get those revenues, if we don't see the economies operate the way they should, we're back to the property tax as our only means of raising revenue for providing the service. And by the way, we don't get to decide what our services are as counties. The state legislature decides for the counties what we do as far as the services.
I'm trying to help him out by giving him less things to do.
And that is so considerate of you. And I know that another thing that you two find plenty of common ground on is Medicaid redesign and expansion. Now, I've been talking to you two about this, and you both agree that there is a fundamental problem in the way the system is now concerning indigent health care, but that's about where your agreement ends. Can we talk about that a little bit as far as what you see as the problem and solution, and throw it to you after that?
Sure. Idaho pioneered single-payer health care. I mean, people are surprised when I say that. They think, wow, it must have been California that came up with that, or maybe New York or Connecticut. Actually, it was Idaho, because the government is designed, the counties pick up $11,000, first $11,000, and the state picks up the rest. That's a horrible system. It needs to go away. Medicaid expansion doesn't solve the problem. Medicaid expansion just puts the cost off to our kids and grandkids to pay the bills. And on top of that, we have no real control over how that system operates. And once we get into it, because the federal government's calling all the shots, they've got all the money, once we get into it, there's no way to get out of it. I'd also say that the other problem is it's a misdirected attempt at placating people in the states by saying, here, we're going to give you 90% of the money. We're directing that 90% at largely childless, able-bodied adults, which displaces the people who really need help, including poor people and disabled people.
Let's be honest, it's a single-payer system, the indigent program, the CAT program. It's not designed to provide direct services to those who need it. It's designed to be a safety net for the providers. That's what we do through the indigent program in this state. The counties and the state together are spending $52 million a year on both of those programs. And that's a problem. And it's a big burden on the property taxpayer in a lot of counties around the state. The other part is that why are we using local dollars for that service? Why aren't we taking advantage of the federal dollars? The federal dollars are going to be there, assuming that the program continues in place. We are continuously placing that burden on the counties and the local property taxpayers, on the state taxpayers, when in fact we could shift that burden to the national taxpayer. That others are going to get that money. I don't understand why we don't take advantage of that in Idaho.
But when we talk about the money that's there, it is still money that comes from taxpayers, just on a federal level. And so is there a long-term solution to the problem that doesn't involve taxpayer money?
No, there's no, for the poor, I don't think there is. I think we're always going to have to be a safety net for the poor and those who don't have the ability to pay for health care services. We'll be in the game some way or another. I just don't know what that would look like long term.
the taxpayers who are going to face the burden haven't been born yet. I hear, there's a rumor out there, I don't know if it's true or not, that the federal government is broke. So putting that burden on quote-unquote national taxpayers I don't think is the solution. I do think there's a free market solution. We have systems out there with people and dollars that we could commit to improving not only the quality of care, but access to care and improve patient outcomes. But we're not doing that because we keep going back to let's have the government solve the problem. Government doesn't make healthcare more expensive and better. Government actually makes it, did I say that right? Government doesn't make healthcare less expensive and better. Government makes healthcare more expensive and worse. And so if you expand Medicaid, that's where we're putting our system, our people, the citizens of Idaho into. We're putting them into a broken Medicaid system funded by a treasury that's completely empty and frankly, I think morally bankrupt.
But at the end of the day, we have this system in place that relies on taxpayer dollars to take care of indigent health care for people who cannot pay. So why not take the money that's already there and do what other states have been doing?
A lot of states are saying no. Most of the states are saying no. And the reason they're saying no is because the Medicaid system is broken. And they don't like the fact that the federal government is going to be calling all the shots when it comes to how their citizens are treated and provided with services. And again, I wish that the federal government would get out of trying to solve problems, because every single time the federal government tries to solve a problem, it raises costs and makes programs more and reduces the quality of care. Every single time. And this has been going on since the 1940s. We know this to be true. Every single time the federal government has gotten involved in healthcare policy, it has made healthcare more expensive and less and did decrease the quality every single time.
I defy anybody to serve as a county commissioner in this state. I would challenge them to do that when you're faced by your neighbors and your friends who have gone through economic devastation because of health care problems. They sit across the table from those commissioners every day in this state, looking for assistance, looking for support. It's the system we have. I think there is some moral obligation to take care of our neighbors, and that's the way we do it. It's not all theoretical. It's not all national debt problems. There is a community of interest here in dealing with the issues that we have. County commissioners face that every day of the week.
And there is a moral imperative. He's absolutely right. We should take care of our hurting friends and neighbors. We truly should. Politicians shouldn't do that. People in the community, organizations, churches, neighborhoods, family members, other organizations that are involved in charitable delivery of services, they should be solving this problem, not a group of county commissioners, certainly with all due respect. And I know that's the position the county commissioners have been put in all these years, but I think they've been wrongly put in that position, and it has ruined and decreased the quality of care and increased costs.
Well, and this is a conversation that we're going to continue to have over the coming session and maybe on after that. So I know you're both busy. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Melissa.
Glad to do it.
Thank you.
Thank you.